Hi, my name is Caitlin Farthing. I'm an art restorer / conservator and historian. The thing that I study the most / work the most with is applying fine art theory to things that are not traditionally considered fine art, things like video games and comic books, and then the ways that we use visual language to communicate across spoken language barriers. The design of things and what the design of the thing you are looking at is telling you about it. The things that you cannot have a character exposition dump at the player for 50 minutes.
I'm the other guy.
And this is the most singular, most intelligent, beautiful, wonderful human who's ever existed. I'm not biased. This is my husband.
That guy could not make it, so I'm in his place. But anyway, my name is up there. My name is Alex. I teach at the Westchester University at Wells School of Music. My PhD was in 1920s through 1950s jazz in New York, but lately I've kind of started branching out a little bit more and being interested more in video game music, in how video game music is composed, how it communicates a lot of information to us, and so on and so forth. And it's boring shit, whatever, who cares? Also, fun fact, we say the fuck word a lot.
Yeah, you're gonna hear us swear. If there's small children, now's the time to leave. Yeah, this is definitely not a PG panel.
Like I'm gonna keep it down somewhat. But I won't. But probably I won't.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Also,
so,
real quick, just because a lot of people came in, real quick, trigger warnings, we will be discussing things like violence, the racism in Bioshock Infinite, cult imagery, things like that. Just be aware, because a whole bunch of new people just walked in.
In the interest of being respectful of everybody's time, because I realize that you guys are committing to an hour and a half of your time, which is, obviously you could be doing more things with it, but here you are. So thank you for that, once again. But in the interest of being mindful of everyone's time and commitment, here's the outline for today's lecture. Here's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to begin with a brief history, then we're going to dive into Bioshock 1. We're going to talk about the premises of philosophy, and particularly in context. We're going to talk about the Rapture and how it reflects capitalist ideas and Randian ideas. And then we're also going to talk about the audiovisual design, such as the artistic design, the architectural design, the haptic design, and also certainly the game design. For Bioshock 2, we're going to talk, it's going to be a smaller section on Bioshock 2. So we're going to primarily deal with the narrative framework. We're going to talk about the gameplay loop, and we're going to talk about the underlying commentary Bioshock 2 makes on both Bioshock 1 and the various philosophies that are entangled in its creation. Bioshock Infinite is going to be a bit longer, so that's going to be the last one we're going to touch on. Just for the sake of everyone's sanity and my own sanity also, we're not going to talk about the Burial at Sea DLC because yikes. It's I don't know, like, I mean, spoiler alert.
A literal 3-hour panel talking about the DLC.
Yeah, but spoiler alert, like, it sucks, and it basically tries to do a Star Wars where it's tying everything into Elizabeth, and Elizabeth was a catalyst for all of this. Don't play it. It's not good. And then finally, we're going to bring up some concluding ideas, and by the way, I would like to try something a little bit new this time. If you have a question about anything, certainly, please save it for the end. But if it's like a burning question, if you feel like we've misrepresented a fact or omitted something in our research, please feel free to raise your hand and just call it out real quick. I will acknowledge you, and I will be happy to talk to you about it after the talk. Yep. Certainly no shame in it. We're all human. I can be wrong. I allow for that. And you are in some ways maybe even better informed than I am on these things. So that's it.
We're going to try to leave 15-ish minutes at the end for questions, comments, people being very, very smart at us. We will also be available after the panel.
Yeah. So if you indulge me, I will start my timer. We're going to give it 1 hour and 15 minutes. There is no guarantee we're going to get through all of this. This is a massive topic, but that's not going to stop us from trying. So here we go. Okay, so let's talk about general context for Bioshock. I mean, obviously, we have the 3 games, the 2007 Bioshock, which was published by Irrational, or released by Irrational Games and published by Studios 2K. 2 years later, we had Bioshock 2, which was also published by 2K, also made by Irrational, and technically Bioshock Infinite, which I do not care for this cover art, but there it is, was made in 2013. At that point, the Irrational Studios have rebranded themselves to Ghost Story Games, which is like a Ghost Story. There's so many STs in there, and also published by Studios 2K. So, the original history of Bioshock was actually pretty interesting because it was conceived in 2002. It is the spiritual predecessor to the game System Shock 2, which itself was a sequel to System Shock 1, which itself was kind of a redux/sequel to Ultima Underworld 1 and 2. So the immersive sim royalty line goes all the way back to like 1991. I remember reading about Ultima Underworld 1 like back in PC Gamer Mag like in 1990, which, yeah, that tells you how old I am. Shut up.
Don't be mean.
I'm being mean to myself, okay? Just let me have this. But the original concept for the game was that the game put you in the role of Carlos Coelho, a cult deprogrammer who was supposed to be sent to a cult to essentially deprogram a bunch of like essentially Lovecraftian like cult worshippers. Then eventually turned into a World War II lab, and then after a lot of revisions by 2007, it became what it is today, which is basically an objectivist deconstruction of Rankin philosophy.
Ken Levine read Atlas Shrugged and went, ooh, we can fuck with this.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff that happens in Bioshocks is going to be very influenced by Ken Levine reading things and going like, oh yeah, we can absolutely make a game about this, and everybody going like, Ken, no, and say, Ken, yes. I do what I want. But the other thing that I should absolutely mention is that the environmental design was very much influenced by Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, and 4. Particularly, you can see a lot of the environmental design in Bioshock 1 from Resident Evil 4, which kind of borrows a lot of the same ideas of old architecture, kind of weird stuff, very like out of place things that seem normal upon first glance, and so on. So, okay, let's talk about what the objectives for this lecture are going to be. And I have 5, but there's no guarantee I'm going to... Don't expect that we're going to answer each one of these questions. This is more kind of an exploratory deep dive, pun intended, so that we're going to kind of look into a lot of these questions. So we're going to take a look at like what is the long-term impact of the Bioshock series. So like why are we still talking about these games? Like it's been 15 years. Why is it still on the docket?
Why is this room full of people who want to hear two nerds talk about this?
All right, I mean, you're all here, so clearly you are wondering the same thing. 2 is what are some of the distinctive and impactful narrative and design choices made by the developers? A lot of design ideas obviously don't come from nowhere. They are typically associated with a fairly lengthy lineage, and in most cases they tell us something either about the behind-the-scenes process or about the ideas that are being communicated, or in some cases they fully reframe those ideas for a more modern perspective. Because I mean, keep in mind that a lot of Ayn Rand stuff was written in the 1940s and 1950s when capitalism really was the only system to work with. You really didn't have an alternative. It was either be a capitalist or be a dirty red commie, and that was not really an option. The third question we're going to attempt to tackle is what are the basis for these ideas? Like, where did they come from? And in some cases, this is probably going to be the easiest one. Fourth question is why do these ideas still resonate powerfully in game development and narrative writing? So, like, in other words, like, what is the impact of Bioshock vis-a-vis our current game development process? And then finally, maybe where can we go from Bioshock? And that's kind of like a tentative one because there's a lot of different paths we can take from that. Okay, great. So let's begin talking about Bioshock 1. So I'm going to go ahead and assume that most of you have played the game here, right? If you haven't, it's available. Spoilers, but also it's available on most. I think they just came out with the remastered edition of all 3 games. It comes in one tidy package. I think it's like $20. If you haven't played it yet, please feel free to get it. Like it's cool. But also, like by this point, it is a 15-year-old game. It's like spoiling King Kong or the Bible to someone. Like there's a statute on these things, right? So, if I spoil it for you, I'm sorry, but also like that's your own fault. You brought it on yourself. So let's talk about the underlying themes. The core themes for this are very simple. It's predestination versus free will, and altruism versus self-interest. And so we kind of have to ask why these two ideas and where they come from. And all of this cycles back to the philosophical underpinnings of Bioshock, which are Randian objectivism, classical American liberalism, or capitalism, or as I like to call it, anarcho-capitalism, which is basically a very unchecked, unstructured form of capitalism where everybody's trying to grab the biggest slice of the pie, and the object of making wealth is to make more wealth so that you can make more wealth on top of that. The big one that we have to talk about is Ayn Rand's objectivism. So I want to make this absolutely clear. I'm not here to shit on Ayn Rand. My feelings about Ayn Rand are going to remain my own. And those feelings is that I don't like her, but within the context of this conversation, we have to, at the very least, entertain the possibility that she had a point.
Yeah.
Pause for effect.
Yeah.
So those ideas are basically as follows. The first is that consciousness is not automatic. Consciousness is something that we acquire by choice. So in other words, we can choose to think about things, or we can choose to remain peons. The second thing is that value is relative to the concept of life. So being alive is what you contribute to society. Are you a high-value individual or are you a low-value individual? Which is where this idea of the creative versus the parasite comes in. This is very much a concept of Randian objectivism that is brought into the entire philosophical underpinning, not just of Bioshock, but of entirety of objectivism. We also have this idea of the rejection of doctrine of altruism, because if you are contributing to anything, really, you are expected to contribute this with the fullness of the idea of self-interest behind this. You're not giving freely of yourself. You're giving of yourself because you want to get something in return.
The only things you should do are the things that make you happy.
Right.
If you are doing something, it has to be because you like it and because it makes you happy and you derive some kind of joy from it. If you do anything simply because you feel like you have to or because someone else wants you to, that's bad and wrong and you shouldn't do it.
The idea of altruism, therefore, is considered to be amoral. Selfishness is considered to be extremely moral, because much like Nietzsche, who speculated that the best acts are the ones that you do not out of kindness, but out of necessity, this is the extension of that, layered on top of capitalism. Then we have this idea of morality being dependent on one's own individual set of values. That leads us to the fact that rational actions are only the ones that maximize self-interest. So if you're not acting in your own self-interest, I swear I can speak English. If you're not acting in your own self-interest, Rand is really hard. Try reading John Galt's monologue in Atlas Shrugged. It's like, dude, it's like 70 pages and it's all completely serious. Like, I swear to God. It's like, at some point you're basically expecting her to be like, haha, just kidding. And it's like, no, it never happens. It's just 70 pages of prose. Anyway, so the idea is that if you're not maximizing your own self-interest, you are not acting consciously. And finally, it's society benefits most when everyone acts in their own enlightened self-interest. So that's going to be a lot to swallow. Try to keep a lot of these ideas kind of like up here, like put a pin in those, because we are going to be referring to a lot of those ideas as we're going through Bioshock 1.
Basically, imagine every business major you ever went to school with.
Yeah.
Keep that guy in your head while we're talking.
I heard the best thing, I think this was on Twitter, somebody said that I can summarize Ayn Rand in the following sentence. Imagine telling an upper middle class white college kid that they're just being too nice to the staff at their dad's house. Right? So anyway, there is a quote from Andrew Ryan at the bottom of this. You probably can't necessarily see it, but I'm going to read it to you. I believe in no God, no invisible man in the sky, but there is something more powerful than each of us, a combination of our efforts, a great chain of industry that unites us. But it is only when we struggle in our own interest that the chain pulls society in the right direction. So this actually connects us not just to Randian objectivism, but also to the idea of anarcho-capitalism. So think about Adam Smith and the invisible hand that he has discussed. And this is also going to become extremely valid when we're talking about the design of the game as a whole. But Adam Smith said this: the rich are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessities of life, which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions amongst all its inhabitants, and thus, without intending it, without knowing it, they do so. So the conceit that Adam Smith was working off of is that the rich are inherently moral. And this is something that we can actually see in a lot of contemporary media. You know, Tony Stark being the genius philanthropist playboy.
Bridgerton.
Right. Bridgerton, obviously Batman. A lot of these ideas are still percolating into our popular media and a lot of the things that we consume from Ayn Rand. It's impossible to understate the impact that Ayn Rand has had on today's society and on the way capitalism is entwined into contemporary lifestyles. Like, we are consumers. The whole reason that we're here today in this room is because we're exchanging goods for services, right? We're exchanging money in an attempt to, like, have a good time and, you know, buy more shit at the dealers, right? I mean, because that's literally why we're all here. But the point is that it's so ingrained in our philosophy of life in this country that we do this without necessarily realizing it. And so this idea of the invisible hand is not something that just exclusively guides the markets. It's also something that eventually is going to come into play in Bioshock. And so this on-rails design, the tutorialization of the game, is something that becomes extremely important. Let's think back to the way Bioshock starts, right? So you open up with Jack being on the plane. Put a pin in that. We're going to be on a plane, and then the flight attendant comes around and says, "Sir, would you kindly put your tray up?" Next thing we know, there's a crash. You wake up in the middle of the ocean. There's a lighthouse. You walk into the lighthouse. You see this image. No gods or kings, only man. And there's a giant statue of Andrew Ryan. I'm going to go ahead and just extend this to you all. Look at this and tell me, or just think about what the ironic thing here is. There's a number of ironic things, right?
The irony of turning yourself into a statue of a king or a god and then saying, "I'm not either of those, I promise."
Right. Andrew Ryan lives in Point Hephaestus. Hephaestus is the god of the forge, right? The fact that he's using a bright red banner with yellow lettering on it is also very reminiscent of communist slogans and Soviet Russia, right? It's a striking visual contrast with the darkness of the preceding scene, but it's also communicating certain ideas to us subconsciously. We're seeing red with yellow lettering, and we're immediately thinking, okay, 1920s Soviet Russia, right? And so the fact that he is advocating for capitalism, but he's sort of this enlightened version of capitalism where there's no gods, no kings, there's only just the guy that the harder you try, the better you're going to do, but at the same time, he's literally casting himself in bronze. So this is already kind of supporting this idea that Ryan is lying to us. And by extension, given that Andrew Ryan is just a figment of Ken Levine's imagination, that, you know, the game is actively kind of trying to subvert its own trope. So, remember I said, let's put a pin in Jack, the protagonist, right? So, the meaning, Bioshock does this a lot. It will kind of innocuously drop a name or a term or a concept and just be like, don't worry about it. It's fine. Like, just don't worry about it. But like, by telling you not to worry about it, you're like, okay, but what if I like dig a little deeper into that? And then you start digging deeper and you're like, well, okay, that kind of opens up a really big can of worms. So what's in a name? Like, why Jack? Anybody have any thoughts on what Jack means? Yes. That's true. He is the everyman, right? So that's a design decision that was very consciously incorporated, is that you are attempting to inhabit an empty vessel. But there's a deeper meaning to this.
Yes.
It's also very
Yeah.
It's definitely the name that, like, the white guy on the cyberpunk book cover with his rippling,
exactly.
with his, like, rippling muscles and the woman dangling, fainting out of his arms. That's his name. His
Absolutely.
name is Jack.
Absolutely. And sorry? Yeah, absolutely. That's another one. Okay, what's another one that?
All the way in the back. Yeah. Okay, good. I'm going to blow you guys' minds in just a second. All right, so you ready for this? So think cards. What is a jack playing card?
Okay, so what is a jack? No. The jack is the one that's under the king and the queen, right? So it's the lowest one of the major arcana. Right. What's another word for jack? What's an archaic term for jack in older decks?
Knave?
It's a knave.
Yes.
What's a knave? It's a servant or a slave. A man chooses, a slave obeys.
You are told from the beginning.
From the very beginning, you are told that you are not a man. You are following a predetermined path. You're here because somebody wants you to be here. You are serving a purpose. So that fundamentally takes the control of Jack out of your hands. Just think about that for a second. All of those choices you make, whether or not you decide to choose to save the little sisters, whether or not you decide to go to left or right, whichever order you complete the early parts of Bioshock, and all of that is completely out of your control. It's all part of Atlas's plan. Right? So that goes back to this notion of predestination and determinism, which is also something that factors very heavily into the entirety of the Bioshock series. Think about how deeply that idea of determinism is ingrained into Bioshock 3, which we're going to talk about later. And just put a pin in that too.
Yeah. When Bioshock came out, because it is a successor to System Shock, a lot of people did not like how on the rails it was.
Right.
Because even the tutorial in System Shock is a lot more open than Bioshock. And there was a huge amount of criticism that Bioshock was too on the rails, too linear of a story, and that's kind of the point, is that this is going to be a very linear story that you're experiencing.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's by design. You know, I often don't like putting words into game developers' mouths because oftentimes, you know, you utilize the theory of mort d'auteur, and you say like, well, that's not what you meant, and the author's like, no, actually, that's exactly what I meant. And so then you're kind of like left holding the bag. You're like, womp womp, I was wrong. But the point is that this idea of the trigger phrase, would you kindly, that guides you through the entirety of the first half all the way up until Brian dies, is essentially the fundamental driving force behind this entire game. So the structure of this game is actually supporting this claim. Let me just put my face back on.
So look at the way Rapture is laid out, right? So we start in this bottom part right here. So this is where we arrive. So the drop-off point, of course, obviously Fontaine's department store is like at the bottom of the Marianas Trench, like nobody cares. But like all of the rest of this, look at how connected it is. So we have like the railways that are traveling back and forth between different points in Rapture. We have, you know, the lighthouses right there. We have the high street, the Arcadia district, which is where the forests are. And all of these different places are very connected. So you're free to travel back and forth, bounce between those districts at will. The big important thing happens right here. Right? It's somewhere in this area. And from this point, it is a straight line to Point Prometheus, which is where you fight Atlas, which, by the way, right, the name is very on the nose. It is a reference to Atlas Shrugged, but it's also a reference to Atlas, the Greek Titan, right? And of course, you know, Prometheus being like another name for Atlas brings the fire to the people. Except that, you know, and this is why we don't talk about Burial at Sea, because it fundamentally just shits all over the brilliance of Atlas as this criminal mastermind. It turns into this like objectively idiotic figure. So let's move on. Let's talk about this part, how capitalism is connected to Rapture and how these things are all kind of like part of a bigger scheme. So I love showing this clip because this is very informative of how Rapture operates. Like, let's watch. Dropping into the sea there.
The very first thing you are ever shown in Rapture
I am
is this
Andrew
ad.
Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question.
So, no, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. By the way, bye, Ryan Plasmids. Right? The irony is so sharp, it actually like cuts. Because the very first thing this man does is he reminds you that, oh, you should probably spend some money at my place while you're here, you know? So this kind of plays into this whole dynamic that all three of these games have of being kind of a theme park ride. And we're going to come back to this when we talk about Bioshock Infinite in a major way. But the commercialism, the underlying scrupulousness of the entire Rapture society is highlighted from the word go. The moment you step foot into that bathysphere, it's commercial. Now, capitalism is really important to this game. Obviously, like, it's a free market in an insane asylum, right? Because while you're in Rapture, you can collect money, right? And it's like Rapture dollars, like it's by bison dollars, basically. It's like fake script. But you're going to collect this money, and then you're going to be encouraged constantly. Like, the game actually breaks immersion and tells you, like, did you know that you can spend money at vending machines to buy things such as health kits, ammunition?
They actually cap the amount of money you can have. You can only have up to $500 at a time. You have to spend your money. Have to.
And that money is tied to your progression, because guess what? You're going to need to get those ammo bits, and you're going to need to get the you're going to need to get health packs, and you're going to need to get the hypos for restoring your energy, because otherwise none of the items that are in the world really restored that much energy. So it's kind of like factored into the game. And we could argue about the potential gamification of this. Like, yeah, you know, there's vending machines in games. That's nothing new. But in Bioshock, details matter, right? You have to understand that if something is there, it's likely there by design and not just as a way of conveniently getting you from point A to point Z.
When it comes to games and things that are built in an engine like this, nothing is there by mistake. There may be glitches, but you're not going to get the coffee cup on the medieval banquet hall table in a game. If it's there, it was put there by someone and designed by an incredibly intense committee.
Also, keep in mind that Bioshock has had 5 years in production. We're talking about concept art, we're talking about development cycle, we're talking about brainstorming, we're talking about like boardroom meetings. Ken Levine getting in there and like basically just tearing down all of those ideas, like rejecting wholesale entire parts of the story, and in some cases all of the story. So there was nothing left to chance in this game. If it's there, it has to be there. I mean, arguably the only thing are the Vita chambers, but even that kind of ties into this idea. I think that was kind of added as a way of simplifying things for reloading purposes, but that's about the only gamey thing about it. But here's a really important question. Think about what happens when the drip stops, right? So this is something we're actually experiencing right now. So in many ways, Bioshock was very prophetic. You see a lot of these major corporations that are used to unfettered, unregulated growth, just annually delivering 15% increase in revenue on the dot. And just yesterday, what was the big news? Tesla lost literally 15% of its value in a day. This is a company that could not fail. Their stock was valued at $350 a share. That is insane. The fact that they just lost over like $750 billion and more on the way is just proof of the fact that there is no such thing as constant growth. And that's the thing that Bioshock really tells us, is that ultimately, at the end of the day, you're going to be running out of something. You're going to run out of people, you're going to run out of money, you're going to run out of resources, and something's going to have to give. So this utopic society that Andrew Ryan has created, this idea of, oh yeah, you know, just so long as you do the thing, and so long as you're serving everything in your own self-interest, it's going to be fine. Well, guess what, dude? You're going to fucking run out of something sooner or later. And eventually, when that fucking happens, you're going to have people who do have things and people who don't. So you're going to have stratification whether you like it or not. And that's exactly what happens.
And yeah, that's definitely a thing about, they talk all the time in Bioshock about like, oh, the regulations were so awful. Oh, it's so great that we don't have to deal with regulations. It's allowed me to create this da-da-da-da-da-da. But when there's no regulations, there's no competition. One person will inevitably beat out everybody else. And then when there's no competition, where do you go?
But what happens when there is competition? What happens to Fontaine? What happens to his department store? All of the people that Fontaine is supported by are herded into the department store, and Andrew Ryan sinks that shit into the drink. It is at the bottom of the sea. That is never coming back, okay? So the lesson to be learned there is like, yeah, competition is healthy unless it's hurting your bottom line, in which sink those fuckers to the bottom of the ocean. Which is about the most capitalist, like, or anarcho-capitalist you can think of, right? So in that sense, yeah, absolutely, it is holding true to the values, but then you have to remember that the values that you are adhering to are fundamentally flawed. And that kind of digs up the entirety of the flawed premise of this entire society.
There's a really great video that breaks this down. I forget the name of the YouTuber, but it's called After the Shrug.
Yeah, it's Monty Zander.
It's what happens after Atlas shrugs off the weight of the world. What happens? And it's a really great breakdown of what Bioshock is trying to talk about.
Right. And so that also kind of ties into the relative value of wealth, because we're looking at money that's essentially just kind of like strewn all over the place. And we're just like, oh, cool, we just like walk in and pick it up. Like, well, yeah, but you still have to spend it. And also, like, the irony of it is that, you know, money technically has no value, but like that won't stop Andrew Ryan from being like, do not hack the vending machines. Like, he's doing this with the seriousness of Roy Campbell telling Solid Snake to press the select button to like, use the codec. Like, he's like, do not hack the vending machines. Like, I swear to God. And, like, what do you do with that information? Like, I'm going to hack them. I'm sorry, dude. Like, here's your capitalist system. I'm undermining it. Like, sorry. Sorry, that's a thing. So let's like draw back on that a little bit and talk about the audiovisual design for this game. So this is actually something that you can talk a lot about, because Kate's specialty is looking at art and understanding what the meaning is. And so what I have here are 3 examples. The 2 on the right are from Bioshock 1. The one on the left is actually an advert from 1920s depicting a futurist society as seen by people in the 1920s.
Yes, so Bioshock relies pretty heavily on this idea of retrofuturism, which most of you probably know only exclusively through Tomorrowland at Disney World. It's the idea of what the past thought the future was going to look like. So it takes a lot of the design elements of that era and then says, but what if we had flying things? And what if we had this random technology that we really, really want? So Bioshock works very heavily with the idea of retrofuturism. And usually when we see retrofuturism, we associate with the 50s, but Bioshock works very heavily with the aesthetic of the 20s. Art Deco. Very geometric, very Egyptian-inspired, very... I mean, we've all seen it. We all know. It also works very heavily with Greek and Roman themes mixed in with the Art Deco, which is going to happen in any sort of capitalist society, because every capitalist society has decided that we just owe the Greek and Romans everything, and we just need to get back to the Greeks and the Romans. And
I just wanted to interject, because you're absolutely right about that. So you notice that there's a reason why a lot of classical liberals, like, you know, anarcho-capitalists, generally tend to refer to the Greek system of governance or the Roman system of governance as like the best one, and that's not accidental.
Yeah, so this creates Bioshock really very heavily uses the design aesthetic that I like to call old government building. If you've ever seen like old government buildings, because in the 20s there was a huge building boom in the United States.
The New York Stock Exchange on Wall Street.
Yeah. One of the best examples is the post office / courthouse in the Baltimore City. You can see absolutely gorgeous Art Deco designs around the doors, within the halls, around the windows, and then it's got these great Greek columns because we have to reference the Greeks. And so an objectivist society is absolutely going to use that because they want to be trendy, they want to be in the style of the time, but they also want to reference to the things that they think are going to, you know, support them and create the visual aesthetic that they are important. Because Art Deco looks very pretty, but it does not give gravitas. And no one has walked into like a 1920s bar and said, oh wow, this is really serious and important. It's not a design aesthetic that we associate with laws and government. We have to use this Greek aesthetic for that gravitas. And it's an amazing mix within Bioshock of these two that is telling you, this guy thinks really, really highly of himself.
Kate, would you also maybe comment on the medieval aspects of this, like the way cathedrals are constructed and the verticality?
Yeah, it's kind of related. So what you see, this is right here, this middle image that we're talking about, is very, very reminiscent of a medieval cathedral. I'm sure you all have seen them. Super, super tall, big windows, lots of arches, very pretty, very like, let the light in. As soon as the light, they were literally built specifically for the idea of letting in as much light as possible. They were also the group of people who built these things as tall as they could and then realized that they got too tall when they all collapsed. That is literally what happened.
So there's this concept of anagogy in medieval, particularly in like Catholicism, medieval Catholicism, is that being in the presence of things that are divine will bathe you in the light and the essence of God and thus elevate you to a higher status of being. So now remember what Andrew Ryan says and what Andrew Ryan actually means by that. He says no gods or kings, only men. But what he means is no gods or kings except me.
Yes.
Right? And so the fact that he's creating essentially this cathedral-like edifice to his own vanity is very suggestive of the fact that he wants you to revere and worship him as a god king. Right? And this is also not terribly different than what Sophia Lamb does in the second game, although she does this in a very different way. And ultimately, this is also what Comstock does in the third game, which is also not terribly distant from those ideas, but also done in a very specific and focused method.
Yep. So what's great about it is, so we've got this base of old government buildings, cathedrals, everything is important. This man is important and stylish. He is your god. But when you get to Bioshock, everything is crumbling. Everything is falling apart, partially because he didn't build it correctly. That's just a fact. You can't build underwater like this and it's going to last forever. It's not a thing.
Yeah, I thought it was so incredibly clever when I said this Rapture is a city out of time, and then I kind of started thinking about it, going like, oh wow, that really is kind of a super clever way of looking at it, because there's a bunch of different ways of thinking about this, right? First of all, like obviously it is clearly a city out of time. So for those of you who are not familiar with the general timeline, the reason Rapture looks the way it does, and the reason why everybody still talks like an old-timey radio star, is there's a very particular reason for this. Rapture started construction in the 1920s, which means that those people down there have been cut off from the topside world for 40 years. Right? And so they developed along a very different trajectory. So in that sense, Rapture definitely exists outside of conventional linear time, which is something that we are not going to touch on in the context of the DLC for Bioshock Infinite. Nope. So in that sense, it kind of exists in its own little microverse, right? But also, it is a city that is literally running out of time. So there's a brilliant video that, the two names of the architects, Joe Gresovich and Carlos Solis do. I have linked it in the bibliography. And they talk about like why Rapture looks the way it does, but they also comment about why it would be impossible. My friends, it is not possible to build a city that size underwater because salt water is extremely corrosive.
There is no material that can survive being soaked in salt water for years upon years upon years.
Which is
it's
why,
not possible.
Yeah, which is why you constantly see, I think it's only been like a year since Atlas bombs the restaurant and there's a revolution. After a year, Rapture is essentially dying. It is a fully decaying city. So
you are watching this amazing, beautiful, basically sculpture, like giant sculpture to how great this man is, crumbling in front of your eyes as he hides away in the last potentially safe place, he himself falling apart.
Right. And meanwhile, Ryan is kind of hiding in Point Prometheus, or not Point Prometheus, Point Hephaestus, and just kind of playing golf in his office and being like, everything's fine, this is fine, everything's fine. Because like, you know what? I got mine, fuck you. Right? That's it. Like, that's all he cares about. And so when you confront him, he seems not surprised, he's more disappointed, right? Because like, oh, this random asshole is here to bring me down? How dare you? Talking about art. So what about the actual art that's in Bioshock? I mean, so I'd like to kind of get over this really quickly because, you know, we do have to cut some things for time, unfortunately. And this is an interesting thing, and it would be fascinating to do a whole talk about like in-game art that's created by in-game characters. Regrettably, this is slightly outside of the scope of our allotted time. So Rand kind of looks at this as art is something that needs to be presenting really tough ideas in a very accessible way. And there is a quote right there. If you want to take a picture of it, you're certainly welcome. I also have this in my bibliography at the end. But the idea is that Bioshock essentially is the idea of Bioshock being a Randian artwork is something that is inherently kind of common to most critiques of Bioshock, is that it is asking you to assess these extremely deep questions in a very accessible way. Like, what better way to contemplate this really complex microsystem than as a game? And this also brings to mind this binary nature of like most choices. Like, you know, like we always talk about binary choices in RPGs, like by BioWare. Like, do you want to save the kitten or do you want to burn down the city? Like, those are your two options. But in Bioshock, that binary nature actually carries a lot more gravitas. So like, if you save or harvest the Little Sisters, you know, you get more atoms as a result. Like, can you use that atom in a more beneficial way, not just for yourself, but for others? So it's like extended altruism. So it kind of frames these issues as very complex, but in a very simple way. So let's move on. Why don't we? Because I can talk about this game for a while, but we do have 3 games to get through, and we are already, yikes, we are like at halftime. So let's move on to Bioshock 2. Okay, so November 18th, 1978. I'm not going to show any of this, but 909 people are dead in Guyana. They are part of the People's Temple Agricultural Project near Georgetown, which is the capital of Guyana.
Many of you would be familiar with this, known as the name Jonestown.
Right. So Jim Jones is an incredibly important figure in the design and presentation of Bioshock 2. Now, superficially, the ideas in Bioshock 2 seem kind of simplistic compared to Bioshock 1, because it's a game that talks about, oh, found family is more important than real family. Yeah, no shit, we have Disney for that. Like, you know, fuck off, right? But here's the thing. Even though that's the underpinning of it, it's the way it's presented and the way it's framed is essentially a fundamental rejection of absolutely everything the first game tells you. So think about it this way. What is the best way to make a sequel? Well, you can either give people more of the same thing, or you can make them think about what the implications of the first one are, and then how they lead to conclusions from there. So think about like Matrix and Matrix Reloaded. I will die on this hill. Matrix Reloaded is actually not a bad movie, so long as you don't engage with it on a purely cinematic level. Idea-wise, it's actually really good, because what it does is it talks about the idea that revolution is great until it becomes co-opted by the corporate overlords. The same thing is true here. This idea of altruism, as it's presented in Bioshock 1, is great until you take it to such an extreme where it becomes toxic. So this idea of apostolic socialism, which is something that Jim Jones has pioneered, the idea of Nietzschean altruism, which is this idea of like, you have to help people even though you don't like it, because it makes you a better person, because ultimately you're serving yourself by doing this. And this idea of rejection of Randian objectives is something that's fundamentally at the core of Bioshock 2. So it is a rejection of every single that Bioshock 1 tells you.
So if Bioshock 1 is what happens after Atlas Shrugged, this is what happens after everything goes to shit. How do you survive and how do you respond? And the sort of inherent human nature of, well, X didn't work, so let's do the opposite and see what happens.
So let's talk about the main antagonist of Bioshock 2, Sophia Lamb. The narrative framework for this game is actually kind of fascinating in the way it presents her, because Sophia Lamb herself, I mean, obviously, names mean a lot in Bioshock. We've already talked about Jack, we talked about Andrew, we haven't actually talked about Andrew Ryan, but you guys all know that he's literally just an anagrammatic stand-in for Ayn Rand, right?
It's literally just Ayn Rand gender swapped.
Right. But Sophia Lamb is a little bit more interesting than that. So let's talk about her. So those of you who are raised Catholic, or specifically raised like, Protestant, will probably remember this Gnostic concept of Sophia, which is the feminine aspect of God, right? It is the more caring and loving aspect of God, as opposed to the more rational and ideological concept of God. Lamb, of course, refers to Jesus.
If you've ever studied medieval paintings, you have seen far too many Jesus lambs in your life.
Right. And then of course you talk about rapture. The religious symbolism there is the idea of the apocalypse, the idea of like everybody getting whisked away into heaven. So the connections go deeper than that, because Jim Jones is kind of also an analog for Sophia Lamb and vice versa. So Jim Jones has actually talked about how this idea of the sky god, like he said that the sky god is no god at all. The real God is me right here on earth, right? And so this idea of Jim Jones being the god of his people is something that the way he treated his followers as a big extended family. He's adopted like multiple children in his time from a variety of different ethnic backgrounds. He referred to them as his rainbow family. So this is actually something that Sophia Lamb also does. She refers to all of the people who are staying behind in Rapture as the Rapture family. And there's a significant emphasis on isolation within and othering without. Like, this is a clip that I love playing because it's... let me just pull this up here real quick. There it is.
Remember, the enemy. This is Dr.
Shoot. Sorry, guys. It's the one where she says, children of Rapture, this is Subject Delta. He is a beast apart. We must tear out its jaw and drive him into the sea. So, like, she refers to you as a beast apart, right? Which, of course, carries all of the religious symbolism of Satan and the enemy and all that. On top of that, we have this idea of the imago, which is something you see on graffiti, on like different shrines in Bioshock and in Bioshock 2, and that refers to three things. So the first is the idea of Imago Dei, which dates back to Genesis 1:27, which is God created man in his own image, which is this idea of elevating man to the status of the chosen species. The second one is actually entomology and metamorphosis, right? So this imago is the last phase of the insect's life cycle as it transforms from a cocoon into an actual insect. And then the imago relationship therapy is the third thing, which is the thing that talks about how we internalize the things that we learn as children and then also act on those things as adults.
So, for example, if you were criticized a lot as a kid, you will likely be highly sensitive to criticism as an adult.
And heck, you know what? This idea of the metamorphosis, which we're going to talk about in just a bit more, is really central to what this game is. But let's start about this idea of metamorphosis from the meta-narrative and gameplay loop perspective. Because what is a gameplay loop, right? It's basically a closed cycle of about 30 seconds where you do a thing, you get a reward, it motivates you to do it again, you do the thing, right? So how does it work in Bioshock 1? Well, you walk around, you find a little sister being guarded by her big daddy. You take out the big daddy. You either harvest or rescue the little sister. You keep wandering around somewhere to find another one so you can get more atoms so that you can get more powerful, right? So ideally, like, the more powerful you become, the easier it is for you to take on the big daddies, the easier it is for you to repeat the same loop over and over and over. That loop is reversed in Bioshock 2. Right, because you are now, as Subject Delta, tasked with protecting Big Dad. You're protecting the little sister, and these little sisters, they're like, they bond with you, right? Because you're the original Big Daddy. You're like, they crawl around and they kind of like do the thing. They drag you by their hand. They call you Daddy. Shut up. And like, it's a familial relationship, right? So much like the relationship that Sophia Lamb has with the Rapture family, you too have your family. You have the little sisters that stayed behind. But then you also have the big sisters, which are like your beast apart. So essentially what this game does is it reverses the loop, right? And so you're no longer playing the disruptor of the loop. You are now playing the protector of the loop. And it subverts the expectation that you have of the game, because it's fundamentally the same game as Bioshock 1. It's flipping the thing on its head, and you're now playing as the opposite of what you had to do in the first one. I have a video, but we're just going to skip past it because it's a whole thing. So what is the underlying commentary? Well, the underlying theme of Bioshock 2 is change. Think about the name of Subject Delta. Delta in mathematics stands for change, right? It stands for variance, the difference between two things. how does this reframe the story of Bioshock? Well, I mean, there's a variety of different things. Like if you look at these screenshots over here, there is this idea of rebirth, right? We already talked about metamorphosis being an incredibly important part of Bioshock 1 or Bioshock 2, but it goes beyond that. This notion of metamorphosis is permeating the entirety of the game's DNA. Rapture becomes this visual stand-in for the existential collapse of zealous autocratic socialism, which essentially is kind of both sidesing this argument, but in a very smart way. It's saying like, okay, so remember how in the first one, Randian objectivism was bad? Well, if you go too far in the other extreme, that's also bad, right? So you're going too far in this apostolic socialism aspect of society, and you're going to see that same exact thing happening. So really what you're looking for is that kind of middle ground, right?
Yeah, so this is generally a really brilliant way to do a sequel, because you can't leave Rapture in this sequel. They have to use the same place. You've been all over it. How do you experience the same place in a new way? You just do it the opposite way. And you show that extremes, full extremes, no extreme is going to work. It's this very human thing, like I said earlier, of this didn't work, so we're going to do the opposite and see if it works. And the point it really is that doing the opposite is not the solution. There is no single simple solution. And you are literally playing out all of this opposite option to you and seeing that it's just as bad and it's just as awful and things are just as crumbling. The buildings are not rebuilt. It's not, they didn't find a magic thing to make everything work. It's just as bad.
And keep in mind that the denizens of Rapture, they haven't stopped using atoms, so they are transforming at this time, which is where this idea of metamorphosis really comes home to us, right? So the little sisters, they've transformed into the big sisters at this point. They've reached puberty, and they are mad. They're insane at this point. The citizens of Rapture, who were like, they were already kind of losing all their marbles. Like, I remember this brilliant scene where there's a woman that is like, you see her shadow on the wall in Bioshock 1, and you come up and she's talking to the crib or the stroller. And then, you kill the shit out of her, like all the 10 ways until Sunday. But then you come up to the stroller and there's a fucking gun in there. And you're like, what the fuck? Right? But it gets worse in this game. Like the whole thing with the lady that takes care of Eleanor Lamb while Sophia is in prison. She's like nutso. And she hates you for many reasons. And you have the option of like killing her, or you have the option of just letting her go, right? And it's a really important choice because she basically goes like, oh, wait, what? You're letting me go? But you're not sentient. You have one purpose. Right? So, and of course, we really can't get away from this notion of metamorphosis as a reference to Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis, right? So think about the way Bioshock 2 starts. It starts in media res. Like every single Bioshock starts in media res, but this one in particular, because you're looking at subject delta already in the mirror, right? So you are Gregor Samsa at this point. You have turned into the giant cockroach. And the part of your life that comes before that, that's like a footnote. Like they barely, they mention it, but it's like supposed to be this big revelation. Like, who was Subject Delta before the transformation? It's like some guy.
I think he was like a performer at a lab or something like that. He was no one.
He dove down.
Yeah, he like accidentally found this place.
Like, oh, communist.
Yeah, he found this place completely by accident. He was like, oh, there's a city here? Okay, cool, let me check it out. And they're like, cool, we're going to turn you into this giant walking monster.
It was just because everyone was liking him more and didn't
because Andrew Ryan has to be in charge.
Right.
No gods, no kings. Only Andrew Ryan.
Only Andrew Ryan. But yeah, so and of course, that ties us into Sophia Lamb's book, which is the catalyst for this whole thing, Unity and Metamorphosis.
It really talks about, because the big thing about this is losing the self. The idea that you are no longer a person, you are the collective.
Yep.
So you are literally starting as a guy who is no longer a person, he is a collective.
Yeah. Again, I come back to this line because it sits in my memory like a splinter. He is a beast apart, right? It's the othering of it, but at the same time, we must tear out its jaw and drive it into the sea. We must do this. as a collective. Right?
So yeah, our first game said, you are the singular most important thing. The second game said, you're not important at all.
All right.
You're not you.
Let's all take a deep collective breath because it's a lot. And now we are finally on to the third part, Bioshock Infinite. So this is where it gets really hairy, my dudes.
Everyone knows, I'm assuming everyone here has played Infinite or seen clips of it and is aware of some of the things that are shown in Infinite. It's racist. It's racist as hell, and it's intentional. It's very actually brilliant.
So I want to actually point this out. This is kind of an important thing. It's like a lot of people, especially now, look at Bioshock Infinite and go like, well, it doesn't go far enough with talking about why racism is bad. And I'm like,
here's the thing. If it went further, it would be parody. If it went as far as it could go.
yeah. My thing is that, do you really need to be explained why racism is bad?
Yeah, so Bioshock 1 and 2, they are not subtle games. Bioshock 3 takes every ounce of subtlety and yeets it as far out the window as it possibly can. This game is beating you over the head with the point.
Yeah, yeah. Racism is bad. Like, no shit, really? Okay. So the game does give you a lot of information that, literally leads you to this decision on your own. Like in the first 10 minutes of the game, there is a couple that are trussed up and ready to be executed, and they hand you like the metaphorical gun to shoot them with and gives you the option. Hey, do you want to kill these two people who have done nothing wrong? Or do you want to kill this motherfucker over here? And of course, like 90% of the people just like throw the ball at Jeremiah Fink. Of course, it doesn't happen because determinism is forever. So this idea of determinism and indeterminism is something that permeates everything in Bioshock. So if we're going to talk about Bioshock, we have to acknowledge the fact that whereas the first Bioshock game is more of an open-ended stroll through vaguely interconnected environments, the second Bioshock is a more or less linear, or rather more or less open levels that are kind of linear in sequential design. Bioshock Infinite is, from start to finish, a straight line. Like, sure, they might give you the option to take the left road or the right road, but at the end of the day, they're both going to lead to the same exact exit. And I think that is not only intentional, but also very informative of what the game is trying to tell you. So let's come back to that, because the philosophical foundation for this game is a little bit different than what we're dealing with in Bioshock 1 and 2, because those games take place much later. This one technically takes place at the dawn of the 20th century. So American exceptionalism and Christ of fascism. This is something that Ken Levine got a lot of guff for not portraying religious conservatism in the right way and not portraying American founding fathers the right way. And I'm like, okay, that's, sure. Let's leave that alone. But also he talks about hyper-capitalism and late-stage capitalism a lot. Those are ideas that are ingrained into the fiber of Bioshock Infinite. And finally, historical revisionism, which is, how do I say this? It's kind of like an exclusively American thing. Okay, being from Russia, like, I get it, because we do that too.
Yeah.
Just a little bit. But I'm going to go ahead and say that we learned that shit from you guys. I'm going to go ahead and, I know where to point my finger, so. But anyway, that's all in jest, but honestly, no one does revisionism the way American corporations do. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Okay, so the early bird catches the Mickey.
Yeah. So does everyone remember when Bioshock Infinite came out? One of the biggest criticisms of the game was that people wanted to explore Columbia more before the story started. And when you go in, it's the lighthouse, it's beautiful, you're being brought up into the heavens in light, and you walk into Main Street, USA. Mm-hmm. That is literally where you're walking to. You are walking into Disney World. It is the exact same design, and there's a very specific reason behind it. They want you to be in this sort of idea of everything's great, everything's perfect, it's beautiful, there's no problems. It's too beautiful. It's too perfect. It's uncanny.
Not to interrupt, but isn't
No, please interrupt.
Like a total inversion of the start of Bioshock 1, because you're going up instead of down, and you're everything's shiny and great and perfect instead of, oh, everything's crumbling down and
Yes.
Yeah.
shitty.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
So again,
It's a great
Bioshock
observation.
inverting itself again. They love to do it.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of these ideas because these are kind of important. So notice that there's this belief that America is somehow, by divine providence, granted special status. And that special status is reflected in its system of laws, in its governance, in
You probably most likely saw this idea when talking about Manifest Destiny. The idea that America has to stretch from sea to sea, that it's our destiny, we don't deserve it. It is already ours.
It's given to us by divine
It is
providence.
fate.
Right. And this ties into the very close connection between American politics and conservative puritanical religions. We don't really have separation of church and state here. And Columbia definitely does not have a separation of church and state because Father Comstock is the spiritual leader of Columbia. He is also the political leader of Columbia. He's also the prophet. He is also kind of the figurehead. So he wears many hats. And as far as late stage or hyper-capitalism is concerned, is that everything essentially boils down to being monetized. So every aspect of Columbia is somehow commercially viable.
You'll see a lot of parallels between when you first show up in Rapture and you're just immediately blasted with buy plasmids, buy this, buy that. And the second you walk into Columbia, it's a carnival game.
Yeah.
You are slammed in the face with buy these things, enjoy these things. A lady who is wearing one of the most revealing outfits in the game literally grabs you and shoves a product in your hands.
She's your drug dealer. She's like, try this free sample.
There's someone, when you had to enter the city, I think a lot of people have noticed this, the priest says, is it someone new?
Right.
And that's the first thing you hear after the commercial.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also, the first time you meet Comstock, it's pretty much the same form as when you counter Ryan directly through a screen.
Yeah.
Yes.
And he's taunting you. And
There is a lot of parallels between Comstock's God King nonsense and Ryan's God King nonsense.
Yeah, no, God King is God King, right?
I mean, all three antagonists were God Kings in some way. They all thought themselves to be gods, even if they claimed that they didn't. The antagonists just get more honest about thinking that they're gods as the games go on.
Yeah. But so the parallels between Columbia basically being a theme park ride and Columbia, the city, being like an idealized version of America, kind of a la Disney World, is kind of interesting in a variety of ways. Because first of all, think about it this way. So both embrace white identity as a linchpin while rejecting non-white identity, but also pay lip service to it, right? So like, how many of you have watched the recent crop of Disney movies where they're like, let's have diversity, and the people whom this diversity is aimed at, they're like, that's not diversity. They're like, no, shh, diversity. And then the other thing is that both are ruled over essentially by the specter of this omnipotent, omnipresent leader. So like, I kind of commented on Comstock and Walt Disney being similar, but Disney was not particularly religious, but he does have a certain spiritual
There is a cult
sway
around the personality of Walt Disney. As a Disney adult, I'm fully aware that I am giving my money to a corporation, but at the same time,
like the endorphins are firing at an accelerated rate. Like, what do you want me to do? Not buy the $70 fucking toy?
And I am fully aware that there are people who are in deep in the Disney thing. It is a cult.
It's an
to
identity.
a certain degree.
It's an identity at this point. Yeah. So then you have the notion of both being divided into motivically coordinated theme parks, right? I mean, we've all been to Disney World. We've all, wanted to go on the Star Wars fucking ride is bullshit.
So when you're in Columbia, it's Battleship Bay and the arcade with the Goofus and Gallant comics.
Soldiers Field, right? All of these different
Everything is
things.
very clean and it's very comic. Everything you see is designed to be. It looks not real. It's comics. It's carnival games. It's the message of what you were interacting with. Obviously, can't be that bad because it's a comic. It's not real. It's fine.
I really noticed in cast out the devil, that the devil looks suspiciously like 1910s caricatures of Jewish people.
Yep. Every single piece of media that you see in the world of Columbia is brilliantly designed because it is Comstock using propaganda to get people to believe what he needs them to.
Or hunt down the Vox Populi.
Yeah, one of the first things.
Let's think about that phrasing for a second. Hunt down the Vox Populi. Oh, those are people, dude. You don't hunt people. Oh, except in Colombia, we totally do. Sorry, my bad.
So the thing you're being told is objectively awful. If
Right.
you watch a lot of those Goofus and Gallant like little comics in the arcade, they're terrible.
Oh yeah. Oh
But
yeah.
because it's a cartoon, and because he's using this aesthetic of Disney, of it's not real, so it's fine. You don't take it seriously, and then you realize every single person here believes this, fully and deeply believes all of these things.
Because they don't really have any dissenting opinion. Oh, dissenters are actually sent to Finktown.
Yep. It's very. Are you guys familiar with the hidden Mickeys in the Disney World? Yeah. It's that. It's a very insidious hidden Mickey.
So Elizabeth, I mean, need I say more?
They've said she's designed.
She's basically. I mean, the designers basically said we used Belle as a template for this. So okay, that makes Songbird the Beast. What does that make Booker? No one shoots like Gaston. No one kills like Gaston. Right? Okay, he's Gaston.
And you are framed as the antagonist the entirety of the game.
Which is kind of a wild twist because up until now, well, I mean, the whole notion of Booker being like a talking, thinking character that you're no longer just inhabiting an empty shell like Jack or Delta, like that's a huge change, and that further contributes to this idea of determinism and linearity. So let's talk about this. This is the thing that I wanted to show you guys because it just kind of highlights how exactly weirdly similar Disney World looks to Columbia. So this is Main Street, USA.
Set in the same time period, that not quite specified, but vaguely early 1900s, good old American, everything was great, don't worry about it.
And so look at the Cinderella's castle in the back there, right? I mean, it stands out visually because it's a one-point perspective, and so it's much like the Monument Island statue, right? And so here we have, let me show you this.
Might have
By the way, the tune that's playing is Hail Columbia, which was the unofficial hymn of the United States until 1931.
Mr. Rossignol, you are terrible.
And so you have this very similar color grading, very similar visual aesthetic. There's Comstock as Disney. You're just like, yo, fuck your hot dog. I'm eating that shit. Just grab that shit like, that's mine now. But yeah, look at that. That's incredibly similar in so many ways, right? And I'm not gonna like make you sit through this whole clip and wait until we get to Monument Island. But let's go ahead and keep going. Because we're kind of close to the end. Actually, I'm very surprised. So, on this idea of revisionism, yes, please.
I was gonna point out every time I replay Bioshock, I noticed that when you get to that spot, right? Mm-hmm. The soundtrack that plays, the first note actually is the same first note as the Bioshock.
The opening of Bioshock.
The first Bioshock.
Yeah, you're not wrong.
The note goes down.
That's right.
Up.
That's right. Yeah, it's a great observation. I mean, and this is all by design. It's truly interesting to hear some of the developers of this game talk at like GDC because they give you some really fascinating and revealing information. Okay, good. So on the idea of revisionism, because this is kind of an important thing, this is the other underlying thing that kind of sets in motion the events of this, and yet another reason why Columbia is a lot like Disney World. Disney does revisionism like no one else does, right? So there's a reason I put Pocahontas up here, because Pocahontas is probably one of the most pernicious ways of using revisionism to kind of communicate some really wacky ideas. Because the way Pocahontas is portrayed is that she kind of has this very a stereotypical approach to being native. Like, she communicates with nature, and she moves in a very animalistic way, and she's also mysterious, right? And at the same time, we also have like John Smith, who is like portrayed as like your typical Western everyman hero with the blonde hair and all this other stuff. But like the reality is so far removed from this, because Pocahontas was like in her late, like she was like what, 11 or 12?
She was 12 when she met John Smith.
Yeah, and then Powhatan did not want to kill John Smith. In fact, the settlers were actually welcomed into the tribe, and then she was like married off to John Rolfe, right? Thank you. So it's like this whole weird thing that like, and you know, it's very easy to say, well, yeah, well, it's just a cartoon, but like depends on who you ask, because there's people out there who are like, oh no, this is exactly how it happened. Like, I mean, think about, you know, somebody who doesn't necessarily have the background in American history that you all do, right? Somebody who maybe hasn't had the exposure or the education, they'll be like, oh, this is how it was. And that's exactly what happens in Columbia, right?
I will admit, Columbia is a lot more insidious and malicious about it than I think Disney World intends to be, but it's very, very similar. These ideas of, it's a cartoon, so it can't be real, and then it's actually saying something genuinely awful.
Yeah. Hall of Heroes. So this is where this idea of Ur-fascism comes in. So Umberto Eco wrote this essay called Ur-fascism, where he outlines the details that something needs to be fascist. Like, that's basically a checklist. So one of the things is that the enemy has to be presented as simultaneously overwhelmingly strong and also impotently weak. And so if you look at everything in Soldier's Field, they kind of have these neat little like nursery rhymes or ditties where they're like, yeah, the native hordes were so unstoppable, but then our soldiers took the field and everything was fine. Okay, well, which is it, dude? Like, are they overwhelmingly powerful, or can they just be taken out by a bunch of guys with guns? Okay, cool. It's fine. So going back to this idea of determinism, like, why is that so important? Well, we kind of talked a lot about like the way Columbia is designed and how it's laid out, and how you experience it is also actually very like fundamentally important to how we interact with it, right? So you're going to go through this entire game basically on a one-track path. There's
you are on a
no
theme park
variation,
ride,
right? Yeah, exactly, and that's the thing. The whole game is a theme park ride.
Yeah, like I said, yeah.
So there's not really any variation. In fact, that factors into why you're playing as Booker DeWitt, because you're not controlling Booker. You're just kind of pushing him along on the ride. His path is already preset. You're just there. You're watching the whole thing unfold, and it's okay. You know what it is? It's Buzz Aldrin's like fucking space ride, whatever, right? Because you're in a car on rails, and like, yeah, you're using the laser to shoot the aliens and score points, but at the end of the day, like, you're still going to end up exactly at the beginning where this is fine.
Yeah, this is definitely nailed home. Like I said, this game drops all pretense of subtlety with the Lutece twins and the heads versus tails thing.
They tell you, you've done this 126 times before this, and every single time the coin tosses come up heads, right? So, I mean, that speaks for itself, really. Who's really playing the game? Like, are you, the player, playing the game, or is the game kind of playing themselves and just kind of like dragging you along by a leash, like, to watch it, right? Because so much of Bioshock Infinite is a set piece for you to like marvel at. And this was kind of a critique that most critics leveled against this game, is like, so much of it is spectacle. It's like, well, yeah, that's the point. The reason that this game is spectacle is precisely because it needs you to experience that de-agencying of you, the player. It takes agency away from you and gives it to your protagonist that you are riding along in the cart with. You're using the pew-pew gun. Like, that's it. The story happens entirely apart from your decision. Here's the really important thing. So Cornelius Slate, right? You fight him at Soldier's Field. You kill him, and well, you don't kill him. You injure him, and then you have two options. You can either let him go, or you can kill him on the spot. Now, he tells you he wants you to do it, but being like not a piece of shit, you're probably not going to want to do it. But then, like, it doesn't matter, because he still ends up being lobotomized at the end of the game. You find him at the Good Time Club in the basement. He's just completely like catatonic. And then you have again the option like to kill him or not. well, and then if you do kill him, Elizabeth's like, oh, I guess that's what he wanted. And if you don't, she's like, I wonder if that's a fate worse than death. So, like, again, it's kind of both siding the whole thing.
Done.
The Chen Lin thing right here, I'm not going to play the whole thing, but it's probably worth pointing out that what the Lutece say to you is basically it's all a matter of perspective.
Dead, Elizabeth.
Dead. So, like,
he's dead. What? Who the hell did...
I see heads.
And I see tails.
It's all a matter of perspective.
Why are you following us? Who sent you? Comstock? What do you want?
What do you see here from this angle?
Dead.
Listen.
And that angle?
Alive.
so either one, like, you can have both at the same time. Neither of one of them really matters that much. Okay, great. So we're pushing on. This is your thing, artistic design and world building.
We've talked a little bit about what Columbia, the original bit of Columbia, looks like. Columbia is designed to tell you from the beginning that nothing is what it looks like, that all of this is fake. And even if you wanted to spend some more time playing in the carnival, it's not real. You can't. You have to go deal with actual life. What gets really, really interesting in the design of Columbia is when you get into the areas that are not Disney World. When you get into the areas of the people who are oppressed, of the slums, of the people who are doing the work to make it look, to make the theme park run. The design of those areas is very, very reminiscent of art critical of the Industrial Revolution. These are both pieces that some people insist that they were, sort of supporting the Industrial Revolution, but it's that art of there is no light, everything is dark, everything is dirty, everything is cramped, there is no space, there is no nature. There is only made things, and there is only the light of the fire that is going to burn you up as you work with it. And if you look in the slums, it's exactly like that. There is no nature. The nature is in a cage because they dared to maybe be associated with the Vox Populi. There is nothing but the machine that will grind them up to make the people upstairs happy.
That's the entire premise of Finktown. It's a prison, but it's also a company town. It's both. This is a fun little tidbit for most of you who are music nerds. This is the one that actually jump-started this entire panel. I was playing through this game, and I pointed this out to Kate, and she's like, dude, you have to talk about this. So this scene, when you get into the Lady Comstock Shrine at Soldiers Field, there is a piece of music that plays. It's Mozart's Requiem. Now, Mozart, this is going to be coming as a surprise to some of you. Mozart did not actually write that piece. He wrote the first two movements and laid out sketches for most of the rest before he died. So he wrote the Introitus and the Kyrie. Everything else is just little bits and pieces. The Mozart Requiem was actually finished by his student Franz Xaver Süssmayr, but it was commissioned. There was like this whole big story about how like the dark man came to Mozart and like commissioned the Requiem and like supposedly was Salieri. It was not Salieri. It was this guy by the name of Count Walsegg, who was actually kind of a dilettante composer, was well known for commissioning works from composers and then playing them for his own personal like private parties and saying like, oh yeah, I wrote this. This is my piece. I wrote the Requiem. It's fine. Right? So, but think about how that parallels everything that you're told in Bioshock, right? Because Albert Fink, Jeremiah Fink's brother, steals music from other dimensions and passes it off as his own. Comstock is full of shit and he's lying to you every step of the way. He's like, yeah, Daisy Fitzroy killed my wife. Like, nah, dude, you did that shit. That's you. So, like, the music actually tells you, like, it reveals the plot twist if you know what you're looking for, right? So this is kind of yet another really fascinating thing, like, that the music really informs us of the wider context of this. And, like, the game is basically like, dude, they're lying to you.
The game is not subtle. It is telling you from the beginning in everything you look at and everything you hear that this is not real.
Yep.
This is fake. Things are so much worse than they are pretending to be. Mm-hmm. Like we said, subtlety out the window. Gone. There is none.
Okay, so let's wrap it up because it's been a minute and we're like down to the last couple of minutes. Okay, so what is our takeaway from this game, from the series of games? Well, the first thing is that I think that Thing X is bad is kind of a reductive and not helpful critique of Bioshock.
That's sort of where a lot of American media tends to start and end, and a lot of criticism of American media, particularly movies, is just X is bad. The movie is saying X is bad. The game is saying X is bad. And that's where a lot of critique ends. And these games, they're going further than X is bad. You could stop at Ayn Rand is bad from Bioshock 1. You could stop at American exceptionalism is bad with Bioshock 3. But there's a further point that they are making.
But I keep coming back to the idea that that's actually not even the thing that Bioshock 1 does. Like, I don't think it tells you that Brand is bad. I think that it tells you that you're looking at it wrong if that's the way you're taking it away. The second thing is that raising uncomfortable questions in an accessible format is actually a good thing. Right? Because that's what Bioshock 1, 2, and 3 really do, is they make you engage with these really gnarly issues.
I mean, there's a reason objectivism is entire college classes.
Right.
It is a layered, intense philosophy, and it is so much more than the business major that you know who's kind of a dick and insists that he's right because he likes it.
Yeah. The next one is, how do we even explore the idea of morality in an inherently amoral, not immoral universe? The difference is that amoral basically means that morality is not absolute and therefore might not even exist. Immoral just means like it's not following the same rules of morality as like what we would expect, right? Nuance, detail, and deriving meaning from small tidbits is pretty much everything in these games. Like, you have to pay attention to small detail. There's like a connection that's being made between Bioshock 1 and Burial at Sea, where they're like looking at the differences between what those titles are telling you and like what the differences between them are, and like what that reveals to us about the parallel universes in which they exist and whether or not they're in the same one. It's a really deep dive, pun intended. Thank you. More on that never, probably, because we're almost out of time. And then finally, the negativity of extreme. So extremes are bad, according to this series, and it's not subtle about telling you that.
It's really not. Especially, it's really, really, really obvious in Bioshock Infinite, in that they make Daisy Fitzroy to be the exact opposite in every possible way from Comstock, and she is made to be very clearly just as bad. Right. She is the exact opposite. He's old, she's young, he's white, she's black, he's a man, she's a woman. Doesn't age well, but this was 2013, so you got to give them a tiny bit of grace on that. So the games are not just telling you that X is bad, they are all but begging you to engage with nuance.
Yes.
They are saying any extreme is going to fall apart. Any singular idea saying this one idea will fix everything is not going to work. You have to engage with nuance. You have to embrace opposite perspectives. There is a reason that the only adult person in the entirety of the series who is what they claim to be and who you can trust is Elizabeth. Elizabeth is walking nuance. She is literally multiple lifetimes put together. Her perspective changes with every single thing that she sees and encounters. Elizabeth is the only one you can trust because Elizabeth is nuance. Not subtle.
Nope. Okay, that brings us all the way to the end. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you for sitting through that. Thank you.